So I was asked to stand here because it's near the speaker, but there's this blinding light coming onto my face, so I'm not intentionally squinting at you. So I'm very pleased to be introducing Dr. Evni, who's actually kicking off the Wealth and Poverty Week on Identities and Inequalities. This is our first talk, and we're going to have several more this week. Her talk is co-sponsored by WGSS and Wealth and Poverty. Eve is an assistant professor in media arts and studies, and she has joint appointment with WGSS, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. She teaches courses on media representations, gender and globalization, and media and globalization. She does her research on cultural production and viewer engagement, feminist and queer analysis of contemporary media, and LGBT activism. Her work has been widely published in academic journals and book chapters, including Communication, Culture and Critique, Feminist Media Studies, Popular Communication, Transformative Works and Cultures, and the Routledge Companion to Media and Human Rights. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ng to the presentation.
Thank you, Edna, and thank you all for coming. Thanks to Dr. Kim for inviting me. So what I'm going to present is part of a larger project on LGBT media and activism in Southeast Asia. And I think I'm the only media scholar for the week, so that's going to be reflected in my talk today. I'm going to draw on media studies as well as critical development studies, gender studies, and LGBTQ studies. As is the case for many research projects, I came to this topic of transnational funding of LGBT activism kind of in a roundabout way. It was when I was still working on my dissertation, which examined LGBT cultural production in the US, that the transnational circulation of texts first got my attention. In particular, online content like web series could at least potentially be seen by viewers globally. And that's what one of my interviewees, who was an American content creator, said about her own work. She said, the key basically for LGBT media is in the international market. There's this potential market of millions. And she said, you'll find a need because in a lot of these countries, there isn't enough freedom for them to create. So they need a place where they can go to find it. Now, she, Dalila Ali Raja, it's kind of bright, so I don't know if you can see the background. She had a web series called Cherry Bomb that ran for 5 years. And she was envisioning content moving from sort of a west to the rest direction, right? A more traditional flow. The second important piece is the transnational distribution of financial and other resources for what I will broadly call LGBT expression. And this term expression allows me to include more overtly political forms that we associate with advocacy and activism, as well as what might be thought of as cultural expression in media. In development studies, we most commonly see transnational funding for LGBT advocacy associated with particular kinds of projects. So one major area, of course, in the last 2 or 3 decades has been HIV/AIDS prevention. But increasingly, we also see funding that supports advocacy for socio-political rights, so marriage equality, legal protection for work, housing, and so on. So I'm going to present 2 case studies, both from Singapore. One is the annual Pink Dot public gathering for LGBT rights. Again, in the background, you see a pink dot. And the other is the HIV/AIDS prevention organization called Action for AIDS, which I'll abbreviate AFA, and a web series called People Like Us that it funded a couple of years ago. So I'm interested in both the character and the trajectory of the media texts produced. That is, what LGBT representations and stories get shown and how they circulate. I'll also discuss how funding for one kind of LGBT advocacy goal, like HIV/AIDS prevention, can have more expansive outcomes. And what I hope is that this discussion will allow us to look at the practices and outcomes of transnational funding for LGBT advocacy in the context of globalization, and what these entail in terms of both economic and cultural flows. Okay, on the topic of such flows, I can't not mention Arjun Appadurai. Over 25 years ago, at a moment when many scholars and popular commentators were seeing globalization, as I said before, as the spread of Western economic and cultural influence to the rest of the world, whether as something positive or something problematic. Appadurai was one of the first to argue for a more complex and nuanced account. Some of you may be familiar, vaguely remember his scapes. Talked about ethnoscapes, the movement of people, technoscapes, the fluid global flow of technology, financescapes, the flow of capital, mediascapes, the flow of media, and idioscapes, the movement of political ideas. The details of these scapes aren't as important as what Appadurai said about the ways that the disjuncture of the flows happens. I was going to add this PowerPoint thing where disjuncture would like get bigger and bigger and flash, but I forgot. But think of that, disjuncture, which means that not everything is going in the same direction, right? So people might be going this way, but capital another way. And another way to think of this is there isn't simply just a global north-south divide. So his example, one of his examples, he talks about India, who may export waiters and chauffeurs to Dubai and Sharjah to the Middle East, but also export software engineers to the US, then laundered through the State Department to become wealthy resident aliens, who are in turn objects of seductive messages to invest their money and know-how in federal and state projects in India. So that that flow is like going India to the US and the Middle East, and then also coming back to India. Despite the sort of complexity of these flows, the theoretical and policy implications of global economic and cultural asymmetries continues to be a key concern of critical development studies. Given trends in the transnational support for LGBT organizations, LGBT advocacy increasingly intersects with globally oriented development practices. And this is due to a couple of reasons. First, while transnational development projects still tend to focus on improvements to life-sustaining resources like food, shelter, healthcare, infrastructure, as I said, there are now organizations targeting socio-political rights, even specifically LGBT rights. Those of you who were at my talk a year and a half ago, this may look a little familiar. So we have the Global Fund, which is a private-public partnership, sometimes known as a hybrid organization, like the sort of RED campaign that came and, well, it's still supposed to be around, but isn't quite as prominent. You have the International Lesbian and Gay Association and Outright International as major NGOs. And then you have also general human rights organizations that do specifically deal with LGBT rights. The other thing is that we have, as I said, projects whose mandates start off as, for example, HIV/AIDS prevention, becoming broader in scope. I want to mention now that a number of critics have said that if we're after a transformative queer politics, HIV/AIDS isn't really the best way forward. Besides the sort of continuing association and stigma of gayness with disease, these kinds of projects tend to set kind of fixed numerical targets, like reduce the number of new infections by X amount. And that detracts from more transformative goals regarding normative, economic, and political systems. More subtly, they tend to use the more neutral, less political language of public health and social services, which makes them more palatable to both governments and donors. So approaches that highlight multiple marginalizations, highlight structural inequalities, have to compete with these reformist, assimilationist efforts. Okay, so now I'll bracket that. That said, I think we can acknowledge that these critiques and still see a lot of interesting nuances to what's going on in terms of transnational LGBT funding. So that's my goal here, to look beyond the activity of the large organizations and see what can be accomplished under conditions of social and political constraint. First, though, a bit of background on Singapore. Former British colony. It's one of many such former colonies to inherit the infamous Section 377 of the Penal Code, which criminalized, quote, carnal intercourse against the order of nature with any man, woman, or animal. In Singapore in 2007, Section 377 was repealed, yay, but replaced with Section 377A, which more explicitly specified the prohibited sex acts as those between men. So sort of letting other kinds of sodomy, what's the word? No longer prescribing those forms. Singapore has the structural characteristics of a democracy, but a single political party, the People's Action Party, PAP, has been in power since the 1960s. And this government has cultivated this, what's called a city nation. Singapore is this one city, but it's also a whole nation, as a secular, cosmopolitan global city, the kind that fosters transnational commercial, artistic, and intellectual flows, the kind that Richard Florida called the creative class, attracting the creative class, and the kind that is, in other words, often gay-friendly. And it's true that LGBT expression in Singapore has become more open in the last couple of decades. But while Section 377A hasn't been enforced as a matter of course in recent years, the government also continues to foster various strands of social conservatism centered on the heterosexual family unit. Some of those official discourses have been marshaled by Christian activists to oppose progressive changes to the norms of gender and sexuality. So from getting books depicting gay penguins banned, and Tango Makes Three, it's a true story about a pair of male penguins at Central Park. I think a lot of us know this book. This kind of action, the so-called Aware saga, where members of a conservative church temporarily ousted the leadership of the Association of Women for Action and Research, women's group. And they accused them of many things, but one of the things they said was that group was promoting homosexuality as normal and positive when it was, they say, problematically pro-Western and contrary to Asian values. In terms of the media, one important constraint is the Governmental Media Development Authority, and that has a mandate to vet all Singapore media content. In practice, it's television and film that is most subject to censorship. So the MDA has made cuts to programs like The Ellen Show, when Obama was talking sort of positively about gay people, cutting that segment, and Glee, cutting lesbian kisses. But the MDA doesn't have the resources really to censor web content as tightly as it does electronic media, although it could legally. There's a bit of a question mark as to what counts as Singaporean, but in general, content hosted at sites outside of Singapore don't need to be submitted to the MDA. So that means like platforms like YouTube can safely host LGBT media even though it's produced by Singaporeans. Okay, so the case studies. Pink Dot first. This is an annual event that has occurred since 2009 in the Speaker's Corner of Singapore's Hong Lim Park. It's one location where you can get a legal permit for such gatherings. And as I mentioned, you see the pink dot. Participants are encouraged to wear pink and then do this as the sort of end of the event activity. Leading up to this day of the pink dot event, the organizers have a series of advocacy videos posted on the YouTube channel. Many of these feature the pink dot ambassadors. These are typically Singapore celebrities who appeal to the public in their capacity as straight allies. But there are also a few videos that consist of short fictionalized narratives. And I'm particularly interested in these as forms of LGBT content. So this one, which is from 2012, is a good example. I don't know, should I get the lights for the video?
Who is this, Terrence? Hey, you faggot, is that your boyfriend? Oh my god, you kissed him! Hey, my dear is here! Stop looking! Do you miss him?
If only I had the courage to stand up for him.
Darren, when is it going to be your turn?
I'm focusing on my career first.
If only I could tell him. There is no need to hide. If only I could let them know that their love for each other is beautiful too.
If only I could show her how much she means to me.
If only gay people could stop feeling guilty for being different.
Auntie?
If only the world could see what I see.
Okay. Well, I think it's kind of very emotional score, this kind of soft focus lens. The tenor of the video fits well with Pink Dot's advocacy around its freedom to love slogan, sort of tugging at the heartstrings rather than anything confrontational, about emotions rather than sex, and highlighting the importance of familial bonds. And it's maybe easy to roll our eyes a little bit at the sentimentality, but a couple of things. First, such content has constituted some of the most widely viewed Singaporean-produced LGBT media, even though these are short-form texts rather than television or filmic narratives. The YouTube postings have like hundreds of thousands of views. And second, this particular Pink Dot video inspired a US group, Pink Dot Utah, to shoot their own version, which is basically a shot-by-shot remake with a few alterations for US appropriate dialogue. And a Pink Dot organizer told me that the Utah group had no communication with their Singaporean counterparts. Like, they didn't say, hey, you know, they just did it. And the first they knew, the Singaporean group was seeing it. So I'll just show you the first, 30 seconds, but it's...
Who's this, huh? Is that your boyfriend? Come on, man. Stop. Look. Look at him. He's almost tired. He's gonna kiss his boyfriend.
If only I had the courage to stand up for him.
If only I could let them know that their love for each other is beautiful.
So really, like down to the, now we're going to focus on the hands being held, shot-by-shot remake. So in terms of flows, we find an east to west flow for this particular media text, even though many other aspects of Pink Dot and LGBT activism in Singapore more generally involve cultural and economic flows in the other direction. Pink Dot has been quite successful at drawing corporate support, most prominently Google, which became the first major sponsor in 2011. Over the next few years, additional companies came on board. This is Pink Dot 2015, Pink Dot 2016. These are my own photos. That's why they're not all, I don't know, well framed, and you have funny looking attendees here. But you can see that besides Google, other media, I think I pointed out this guy last time, right? I don't know why his face is like that, but it kind of matches this guy too. So besides Google, other media and technology sponsors included Apple, Microsoft, NBC Universal, Facebook, Twitter. You have major financial companies, Barclays, Bloomberg, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Visa, and also BP and General Electric somewhere here. Now, even at its inception, Pink Dot's organizers have been aware of the issue of being seen as too foreign. And they explain that the pink arises from blending red and white, which are the two colors of the Singapore flag, which is a red dot on a white background. And in addition, even from the beginning, to actually be part of that pink dot, you had to be a Singapore resident legally, but they didn't used to check that. These discourses and practices constitute an example of what Jasbir Puah has called homo-nationalist expression, right? So it's intended to shield the event from criticisms of being un-Singaporean, like unpatriotic. For years, the most visible anti-Pink Dot action was the Wear White campaign, which was led by the pastor Lawrence Kong. They were all wearing white. They talked about the campaign as constituting a pro-family, pro-government, pro-Singapore message, reflecting the views of a so-called conservative majority. That wasn't that successful, this Wear White campaign, but in recent years, opposition on the basis of the foreignness of Pink Dot has become more prominent, and it had a significant effect on the 2017 event. So opponents claimed that Pink Dot's transnational sponsorship was in contravention of Singapore state policy. So they quite effectively deployed discourses of nationalistic protection of the government, of the country's self-determination. And in a post-colonial context, that retains a useful political charge. So this led to the Ministry of Home Affairs, MHA, to make a public declaration just a few days after the 2016 event against, quote, foreign entities funding, supporting, or influencing controversial social or political issues, including the LGBT cause. In response, Pink Dot launched a Red Dot for Pink Dot campaign. Remember the Singapore flag, a red dot, to attract Singaporean sponsors who could. So before this, when I did my field research, they wouldn't tell me what their budget was. But when they launched this campaign and they were seeking 150,000 Singaporean dollars, I was like, okay, that was probably the ballpark. One Singaporean dollar is like 75 US cents. So their target was 150,000 and they got 240,000. So they well exceeded their target and they got 120 supporters. So good news, the event ran. But the other major change in 2017 was that a 2016 amendment to Singapore's Public Order Act made it legal only for Singaporean citizens or permanent residents to even be in Hong Lim Park. So previously you could go to the park and then when they make the circle, you just are not meant to do that. But after that, it was like only Singaporeans and PRs. So in order to enforce these restrictions, the organizers had to set up barricades around the designated area. And then they said they would be checking the government-issued ID cards, the ICs. This out of the closet into the cage wasn't made by the organizers, but it was there. And various commentators observed this lack of anonymity is probably going to deter a lot of people who are in the closet or not completely out from attending. So in the end, there was still a relatively strong turnout. It was counted at like around 20,000, but that was several thousand fewer than before, 28,000. Okay, so a couple of observations about this struggle over the 2017 event. First, we see these dueling discourses about Singaporean identity, both Pink Dot and the conservative Christian opposition appealing to ideals of family and nation. There's nothing unique about linking LGBT rights to national identity and patriotism. So I mentioned Jasbir Puar. She identified this in the rhetoric of both activists and nation states in other contexts. Gay.com is a US-based gay website, and this is a critique of Israel's pinkwashing. What's specific to a case like Singapore is how prominently transnational funding figured for Pink Dot in the 5 to 6 years prior to 2017. This transnational support was initially seen by many as positive, right? It's like our cause is so appealing that it can attract these sort of household name supporters. But it's also proven to be a site of vulnerability. So clearly Pink Dot's funding is being significantly reconfigured for future gatherings. But that doesn't mean that there is no longer transnational funding for LGBT advocacy in Singapore. It was there for smaller scale activities, even as Pink Dot became the signature event, and it has continued even now. So let me turn to the second case study, which is looking at action for AIDS. Lynette Chua, in her historical account of LGBT activism in Singapore, noted that HIV/AIDS organizing, as in many other countries, provided contact points for gay activists to enter the movement. So AFA was founded in 1988 by a small group of doctors and activists, and it's now the main organization in Singapore addressing HIV/AIDS. It receives some support from the Singapore government. The Ministry of Health and the National Council of Social Services are its organizational partners. But it also receives significant financial support from private corporations, with its major sponsors including MAC Cosmetics, pharmaceutical companies, Abbott Laboratories, and Janssen. And again, we see financial corporations. Here it's Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank, and Standard Chartered. Looking at their financial report, these grants have totaled around 250 to 300,000 Singaporean dollars annually, which constitutes 30 to 40% of their operating budget. Now, especially because it has governmental funding, AFA can't openly lobby for LGBT rights, without risking being seen as biting the hand that feeds you. So its mission has, as it's stated, remains pretty focused on HIV/AIDS prevention. And in these respects, it fits the mold of a healthcare-centered kind of LGBT advocacy, which makes its role in the production of the People Like Us web series noteworthy. So in 2014, Leon Cho, who has directed a couple of short gay films, and he was also involved in the making of a couple of Pink Dot videos. He was approached by AFA to produce a web series aimed at gay men. One main goal was to promote safe sex practices, but Cho was able to create a broader narrative consisting of 6 episodes of about 8 minutes each. He wouldn't disclose the amount of the grant, but he commented to me that it seemed quote, too good to be true. But he was essentially operating like an independent filmmaker, so he was both the director and the writer. He cast the series by reaching out to his professional and personal networks, and he did much of the post-production himself. The title People Like Us is a term that LGBT Singaporeans have used for self-identification. So it features 4 queer male characters. This was on the AFA website as a blog post. Now, depictions of explicit gay sex have been available to Singaporeans for many years via the internet. Every Singaporean knows how to use a VPN to access Netflix. But Chill series is the first such locally produced televisual narrative. A lot of the series actually plays out more like a romantic comedy. Each lead character faces their own struggles in the search for love. So here is a short clip from episode 3. We'll see a character, he's called Rai, on dates with a few different men before all the dates are wrong for one reason or another, and then at the end he gets in touch with another main character by text. Can you read that?
So, what do you do in your free time?
I like to travel, see how different people live in different places.
The salad here is really good. The food is here.
That looks really nice.
Oh wait, don't dig in first. I'll take a photo. Can you lift up your plate because I can't see it?
Is this really necessary?
Yeah. Smile.
What are you doing?
Well, it's not that I don't trust the hygiene here, but there are a lot of germs you can't see.
Where's the last place you've been?
I went to Paris and then I took a train from Paris to Amsterdam. The architecture there is just really beautiful.
So, what do you do?
I'm in the army right now.
Anything interesting happen in the army?
You look like you don't believe me. Here, take a look. Look at all those germs. Well, dig in.
I just got 49 likes.
Wow. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'll try some of this cupcake. It's good, right?
So, what do you want to do after dinner?
I was thinking maybe you can come to my place.
Hey, Rai, can I ask you a random question?
Sure.
Can I keep your underwear? I really like this brand a lot.
Spoiler alert, those two end up together. So it does get more hot and heavy than this clip. In the previous episode, we see Joel, the guy that Rai is texting, and another character get naked and come very close to having sex before the condom broke. But even the most sexually explicit scenes aren't remarkable by US or Western standards of independent LGBT media. However, these scenes are notable in the context of LGBT content produced in Singapore. As I put in the abstract for this presentation, which no doubt you all read, funding originating from more specific mandates can end up taking different cultural and political trajectories. So what I mean is, in conditions of constraint, this support enables specifically Singaporean LGBT narratives that otherwise would not be made. People Like Us was commissioned by an HIV/AIDS prevention organization, which in turn is partly funded by major corporations like MAC Cosmetics rather than some more radical source. So the fact that this web series pushes the envelope further in its representations of queer Singaporean men more than anything prior, I think invites us to rethink what the possibilities and limits are. In addition, Leon Cho has taken People Like Us onto the global film festival circuit, mostly those specifically for web content, although also a couple of festivals focused on either LGBT content or Asian-themed content. And it's won a couple of awards, including Best TV Short Drama at ITV Fest in LA in 2016. Also Best Web Series at the Formosa Festival of International Filmmakers in Taiwan. That has expanded its footprint. And from a sort of academic's perspective, it's complicated the economic and cultural trajectories of the series. That is, it's not simply that big commercial money gives us boilerplate stuff, while independent production is what yields groundbreaking content. And in fact, in media studies more generally, the very division of mainstream and independent has been problematized in contemporary contexts of hybrid production and hybrid sort of narrative characteristics. And now, it seems, this permeability is also the case for something as relatively small scale as People Like Us, and it's happening as part of transnational LGBT-focused funding. So I don't want to overstate my case. I'll make a plug for my forthcoming article in Development and Change, where I dwell more on the problematic questions about transnational funding around sort of these north-south asymmetries. And the other issue is that these smaller efforts have to compete with larger platforms that host LGBT content. I mentioned Netflix. Netflix became finally legally available to Singaporeans and others in the region recently, and that has really transformed the sort of streaming landscape. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize the significance of LGBT series such as People Like Us, and I would say even those pink dot promotional videos. At the risk of being a little tangential, I've been, and I know there are geographers in the room, so bear with me. I've been interested in questions of scale ever since I encountered the anthropologist Anna Ching's work on globalization and its effects on both the human and natural worlds. So she wrote that scale is not just a neutral frame for viewing the world. Scale must be brought into being, proposed, practiced, and evaded. And in their 2012 volume, Geraldine Pratt and Victoria Rosner also argue for looking at local specificities, not simply as a contrast to the global, not saying, okay, this is local, this is global, but because the global and what they call the intimate co-produce each other in ways that highlight the need to attend to scale. So if we come back to considering transnational LGBT funding in the more general context of transnational flows a la Apadurai, what we have is not just economic flows going in multiple directions, or economic flows going in one direction and cultural in the other, but something more complicated and I think more interesting. So yes, LGBT content travels not just from directions other than north to south or west to east. We saw a couple of examples here. But it's also about the significance of smaller scale efforts, which might stay relatively local, but can also come to engage in domains other than where they started off. So in following the trajectories of these kinds of efforts, I think we get a fuller picture of what's going on with transnational circuits of funding and media production around LGBT expression. Thank you. Any questions, comments? Yeah, yes.
I'm Young Kim Geography, and thanks a lot for giving Voice and Poverty such a wonderful talk. Indeed, this is our first time to have a joint talk between WGGS and WNP. So we should do more. Indeed, Voice and Poverty folks, we are still very much into income inequality or wealth distribution or overall economic aspect of inequality. So I think we should do more so that we can have a better understanding of inequalities. So that's, but then here my question is, it's more about Singapore. At the beginning of your talk, you talked about this disjunctures between different aspects of the globalness. Indeed, Singapore has, in the past 2 decades, I think, identified itself as Asia's hub of global talents. So that they try to attract all those multinational corporations, these international executives, the regional center don't go to Tokyo, don't go to Beijing or other big Asian cities. Singapore is more embracing and more of that. But then at the same time, they identified themselves as Asia's production side of global media or global.
Yeah, I don't know if you can tell, but this background is like they produced a series of stamps. It says Singapore's globalization journey. Like you see different aspects of that, construction and so on.
So I was wondering, it's pretty much a capitalistic, materialistic motivation behind this, but let's say I'm a geographer. So if you place Singapore in the Asian map, so Singapore is indeed the place that can embrace East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. I mean, ethnic makeup-wise, geographical location-wise, everything. So, and then there is a huge market, whether that's a potential market or that has already been realized, a huge market for LGBT media. So media, whether that's entertainment or news or whatever. So I was wondering, I don't know, when I saw that Asia's production side of global media,
you would think, right?
Singapore
yeah.
would go for that.
Right, like the way that, for example, Sydney in Australia has become a major tourist destination for LGBT travelers. Like, why not Singapore? It's like at the crossroads, as you're saying. I mean, I think that, as I mentioned, homosexuality is still illegal. Maybe not anymore for women, it's unclear, but Section 377A stands. And that constrains a lot of things. Now, that doesn't mean there haven't been sort of shifts. So a couple of historians have traced LGBT expression in Singapore sort of leading up to 2004. There was, greater and greater openness, and they had these, what were they called, nation parties, which were sort of gay dance parties, which the government itself was helping to promote, sort of a little bit under the radar, but there was funding. But then there was a turn. So you have, on the one hand, the former Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, famously saying, well, they can't help it if they just, do their own thing. We're not going to bother them, homosexuals. But you also have the government saying, the bedrock of Singapore society is the family, and the family is the heterosexual family. So there are many sort of conflicting discourses. One piece of my research which I didn't talk about is in terms of cultural expression, theater in Singapore has been quite a more open space than television and film. So, theatrical pieces also have to be submitted to the government for approval before you can perform them, but they have routinely approved quite openly lesbian and gay themed plays over many years. Will they try and censor particular aspects? Yes. So one lesbian play director talked to me about how she had two girls kissing, and the government censor person was like, is it lesbian? Are they kissing because they're attracted? And she was like, well, what would count as that? And she was given the sort of how many seconds they could kiss for restriction. But in the end, she could still put the play on. So it's not like the government is censoring all LGBT content. And there are there are gay and lesbian bars. I mean, in many ways it's quite free, but in terms of media depictions in the mass media, there's still a lot of constraint. Mona.
So I was very interested in the part of what you're analyzing here, the claim that LGBTQ advocacy or identity goes against Asian values. And I was curious, you said at one point there was that kind of claim. And I'm curious to know how other, I guess, sort of cultural influences are part of this sense of Asian values. Because you also said that one of the main kind of anti-pink dot was from a conservative, a Christian pastor, which would very much seem like a Western.
Yes.
So I'm just sort of curious to know how something like religion or secular identity is sort of functioning as framing what is Western, what is Singaporean. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that. So I'm sort of curious about that aspect. So, I mean, like, if you have evangelicals saying, being gay is wrong, does anyone say, well, that is a Western import as well? Which it kind of seems like it would be.
Well, yeah, if you look at what Pink Dot says in response, they don't say, hey, homophobia is, or like sort of intolerance for sexual deviance, which we know has a long history in China, for example, and most Singaporeans are ethnically Chinese. They don't make that argument saying that if you look historically, they will just try and reclaim those discourses of family and Singapore, loyalty to Singapore, or being good for Singapore for themselves. So in response to Lawrence Kong's accusations that this was going to be against the family, Pink Dot has said sort of repeatedly, we are also pro-family, but we define the family in many ways. There are single parents, there are families with no children, and there are same-sex families. So that is their response to sort of say, these are all families in Singapore, and to be sort of pro-Singapore means embracing all of these kinds of configurations. But yes, I mean, I think Young was also getting at this. Singapore has this, interesting, complex identity in terms of West versus East, because geographically they're clearly in Asia, ethnically with Chinese, Indian, Malay, they're Asian, but unlike some other countries, for example, in the region, English is the dominant language, and I think in my previous talk I talked also about Malaysia. So compared to Malaysia, Singapore is much more west-facing and trying to cultivate this cosmopolitan global city image. So that's the thing, like that cosmopolitanism in other cases like Sydney and San Francisco also involves discourses of gay tolerance and actively sort of soliciting LGBT residents or employees or whatever. But in Singapore, it's much more mixed there. Joy.
I'm really interested in the appropriation of the ad from Singapore in Utah, and for similar kinds of reasons. And so Utah has a particular identity when we talk about scale and problems of thinking about the U.S. as the West and as though that is an undifferentiated West. I mean, I think most Americans think of Utah as this kind of peculiar place in the United States, right?
Fair enough.
And so I'm wondering what that process was like. Obviously, a lot of the Mormon Church is still committed to having missionaries all over the world. So how is it the case that that there was that the church was actually actively involved in pursuing this kind of an approach, or because they were
not the church?
Yeah.
I mean, what the Singaporean organizers told me was that the whole idea of having pink dot as the LGBT gathering versus a march, which is more common in the in the West, where you like march down a street or some path, is that when homosexuality is illegal, or there are other sort of social sanctions against being out, there's a fear that a march, there aren't enough people. Like, it looks kind of pathetic if only like 60 people are marching, right? But if you can get allies to come and you just are all in this pretty confined space, you can kind of make a statement that's visible and kind of inclusive. So his take on Pink Dot Utah is precisely because Utah is far less tolerant than much of the US. This is why they also thought, oh, okay, this is a good kind of event for us. Like, it's sort of, Pink Dot has always been more aimed towards straight allies, sort of inviting them to join and asking them to make themselves more sort of educated and come and support their children and so on. And so I think that is the similarity. But I take your point that Utah is not all of the U.S.
No, but I think that's really interesting, because then the relevant dimension of the appropriation is really, looking for messages, looking to places in the world that might be similarly conservative rather than East versus West or
right. Yeah.
So, and it's also really interesting for me to think about what you were saying about, the family focus, ally focus, and then the marginalization of like sexual expression rather than sort of playing the politics of
although
respectability.
That kind of politics is, as you know, also very prevalent in Western LGBT movements. So.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. Just one small question. As someone who comes from a former British colony with the similar laws, I'm curious as to how the fact that in Singapore homosexuality is illegal and there's the law that, if someone wants to, can mobilize to get other people in trouble. How does the existence of that law get applied, either maybe for political reasons or for some other reason? Because clearly people are not being prosecuted left, right, and center, right? Are there like selective prosecutions, or it's
not in Singapore really? Yeah, I mean, this is versus in Malaysia, for example, where there have been quite prominent selective prosecutions, like the former Deputy Prime Minister. But in Singapore, it's kind of like, yes, here's this law that says it's illegal and punishable by whatever, but it's not applied. And the government has kind of said, because we don't apply the law, so why the need to repeal it? It's not like it's having effects on people's lives. But people say, yeah, but having a law saying what we are doing or who we are is illegal is problematic. Yes. Patty.
Yeah, you know, I was intrigued by what you said about lesbians probably being exempted from the law, and so I just Googled it. Now I'm an expert too. But I'm wondering, I mean, it really does look like, you know, based on the actual text as translated there, that it really is about men doing things with men. Is there talk among, you know, women there of trying to push the envelope on this a little bit? And I mean, because if that truly is not legal, trying to maybe, you know, leverage that in some way to show that, you know, I'm not sure what way, but through media or whatever,
yes,
representation.
For sure.
To push for repeal for the sake of the men.
The most sort of radical and queer, like explicitly queer politics focused group in Singapore is Sayoni, which is a group representing queer women in Singapore and sort of Southeast Asia more broadly, but they're based in Singapore. I think I can't remember, did I mention this in my last talk? But maybe you don't remember this anyway.
I remember something about it.
Yeah, so Sayoni, so Singapore is a signatory to CEDAW, the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or whatever that stands for. So when the Singapore government submitted its report, Sayoni submitted a shadow report, and that shadow report had been funded by what used to be called ILKIRK, so it's now called Outright. They had Sayoni had requested, send us people so that we can document instances of discrimination in various, like, you know, housing and work and so on for queer women in Singapore. And they did that, and they worked on this report for 2 years, and they compiled it. And part of their if you go to the Sayoni website, you can see that report. But they say, yeah, like, okay, maybe it's not technically illegal anymore, but it doesn't sort of prevent all these forms of discrimination. Anything else? I know it's 1 o'clock, so. Okay, well, thank you very much.